Well, it's a genocide, and I think the International Court of Justice will most likely reach that definitive conclusion when it makes its final decision. It made an interim decision saying that there were plausible grounds that Israel is committing a genocide. More recently, the special rapporteur of the Human Rights Council has also said that Israel is making genocidal actions according to the standards of the 1948 Genocide Convention. So genocide is, of course, is a horrific crime, but it's also a legal standard. It's based on a global convention that was promulgated and adopted in 1948 after the Holocaust, and it puts forward rigorous conditions, and it seems to me that Israel is violating those conditions. Ultimately, while there's the very practical issue of the war and the deaths, and that is a practical issue for politics, diplomats, statesmen, and the like, there's also a legal standard which will be adjudicated, and which, to my mind, points to this completely shocking and awful fact that we are most likely seeing a genocide before our eyes, and it's been going on for months. And the world, not the world, the big powers, and especially the United States, are unwilling, unable to take basic actions to stop it. So the difference of this and the Holocaust or other earlier genocides is that they weren't recorded day by day on video. And now we see live coverage, we see journalistic reports, albeit Israel is almost surely targeting and killing journalists in large numbers. This is another basic fact in an attempt to hide what's going on. But Israeli soldiers in the Israeli Defense Forces themselves post their own videos celebrating the destruction of Gaza. So we see day to day, and yet the world doesn't stop it.
Yeah, it's absolutely devastating to be watching this. And the toll that it has taken on people for 6 months is just insane. I think I agree with you, obviously. And I think one thing that is perhaps unique about this genocide, as far as I can tell, I don't think there are many genocides where the leaders of the perpetrating army were quite so vocal and so clear about the fact that they are out there to destroy an entire population. I mean, it's just, it's if Palestinians had tried to fabricate fake quotes made by Israeli leaders, I don't think they could have come up with something as damning as what the Israeli leaders themselves have said. I mean, you have the president of Israel who said there is no such thing as an innocent civilian in Gaza. We're talking about a population of 2.3 million people, half of which is under the age of 18, roughly, and so a very large number of children. And he's just out there saying, for us, there are no innocent civilians. The prime minister of Israel is also going on about invoking verses from the Bible, which specifically instruct to spare no child, no woman, not even spare their cattle. And this is what the soldiers are singing about and posting on YouTube. We've never had anything like this. I think perhaps in the Rwandan genocide, there was some kind of public, but the world wasn't paying attention. So it wasn't as if the Rwandan leadership was getting on CNN and saying, no, there's no such thing as innocence there. But here we do. We have it. It's all being televised and all being transmitted, and it's startling.
Yeah, what I think is very interesting about this is, first, these statements, these videos are all being listed, recorded, and submitted to the International Court of Justice. So this is the body of evidence. And as you say, the Israeli leaders have made their own body of evidence. They haven't hidden it. You just watch, and it's unbelievable. Second, it's clear that they live in a bubble. They're talking to their own followers. They're at rallies as if no one else is listening, but they're all being recorded and then translated. Third, they think I'm sensing that by speaking in Hebrew, they're not speaking to the world, but the world hears all of this. It's not so hard to translate, to put subtitles to the videos. I think what you said is extremely right and important about the biblical quotations, because there's something, complicated going on. Israeli society is multi-layered. There are many secular Jews who are afraid, and they are subject to fear and fear mongering. There are also highly religious Jews who live in a biblical or Talmudic world, meaning that their reference points are literally the Bible, not as an ancient text, but as their daily touchstone in reality. And for a very important part of religious Judaism in Israel, it's the Talmud, which is the interpretations of the Bible written down from oral law and then further interpretation, roughly from the first century AD up to the 4th or 5th century AD. So there's a lot of truly medieval thinking underway, and even biblical primitivism, I would say. And in the Bible, it's pretty shocking when you read the Bible, the Old Testament, especially parts of the book of Deuteronomy and a book called the Book of Joshua. The Book of Joshua is after the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is the Jewish Torah. The next book is about the conquest of the land of Canaan, which then became basically the land that is claimed by Israelis today. And that was through a conquest. In the Jewish lore, the Jewish story, Jews escaped from Egypt, from the burdens of the Pharaoh, where they were slaves onto Egypt. They escaped, led by Moses. They wandered in the desert for 40 years, and then they conquered the lands that had other people in it. So this is actually the religious story, and it's based on the idea that God gave a promise to the Jewish people that this would be their land. And when they conquer the land in the book of Joshua, it's literally genocides, one after another. There are named populations, and the instructions to the Hebrews that have come to conquer the land is kill everybody in it. Pretty strange, actually, I have to say. I'm, very secular. Reading this as religion is pretty grim. That it's a command of genocide. It's not, we had a war to conquer what God promised us, but rather the instruction is, don't be shy, Joshua. Don't hold back. Kill every man, woman, and child. And so it is a text, sad to say, of genocide and bloodshed. And then it's interpreted by rabbis in the Talmud afterwards. Okay, there's lots that can be said about ancient religious texts, but reading them literally as if it's the 2024 reality is not a very prudent thing to do, in my opinion. It is an invitation to mass killing. And the reason I go into all of this is that, sad to say, and it's shocking for me, is because I'm an American Jew, to hear rabbis speak in this way. Rabbis, a rabbi for me is a religious figure, and in my upbringing, the idea was a rabbi was a a holder of ethics, who helped to inform ethics in our Jewish community. But the ethics that the rabbis, not everyone by any means, so I don't want to be misunderstood, but there's a part of Israeli society that's very powerful politically right now, in which the rabbis talk about mass slaughter of Palestinians as if it's basically the command of the book of Joshua. And to hear this is stunning. There are tapes that one can find of rabbis who lead yeshivas, these are religious schools, who are asked by their followers, and they're on video. These are then posted. Rabbi, do you mean to kill all the men and women? Yes, they are all guilty. They are all supporters. They are our enemies. They want to kill us. Rabbi, do you mean to kill the children? Yes, we should kill the children because they will grow up to be haters to kill us. And this is rabbis talking. So part of this that we're seeing of this lack of disguise of, intention is actually deep belief that is not seen inside this belief system as something wrong, but as actually something religious. I'm sorry to say it. It's grim, and over time there have been very knowledgeable religious Jewish critics in Israel over the last 50 years who wrote some important books that I had never read until the last year, and in fact, until recently in many cases, to try to understand what's going on, who warned about this, who said, look, this is what this strain of Judaism actually believes. It's not the Judaism I was at all inculcated with as an American, because grew up in America in what is necessarily a pluralistic society, and you don't base daily life on the Bible or on the Talmud, but some do. And then you get these unbelievable distortions that for me are completely shocking, but really are genocidal in clear intent and not hidden because they're not understood to be something to hide. They're understood to be something to follow God's will even. So this is part of the story. It's rather complicated. It's not the whole story, but it's definitely a feature of what's happening right now.
Oh, I agree entirely, and I think it's something that most people are afraid to touch upon because obviously this is, any kind of discussion of anything critical of Israel is immediately going to get you labeled an anti-Semite.
But by the way, just to say safe, I can only surmise I'm very well read in general because I've spent my whole life with a book in my hand, basically. And I try to pack in every day as much understanding as I can. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand my own religious heritage and so forth. And I didn't know a lot of this until recently. And it was only looking at Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and hearing these horrible, horrible, horrible things coming out of their mouth, and then going back and understanding that there were some very sophisticated warnings and analysis about this by professors at Hebrew University and elsewhere, who were then ostracized, by the way, in Israeli society, on exactly the grounds you said. But the reason I mention it is I really doubt that a lot of the American rich Jews who are very powerful in the Israel lobby in the United States have a clue about this. I don't think they know. I don't think they understand. Of course, they should be listening. They should be watching. And the basic point is, it cannot be right under any circumstances in the world to be killing civilians in mass numbers, no matter what, period. It's not even complicated. So I don't forgive them, but I do believe they don't understand actually even the cultural and in some cases the religious roots of this. And of course, you're not allowed to say it, but the basic point is we need to speak as truthfully as possible for our own survival. That's the basic point.
Absolutely, I agree entirely. I mean, I remember after September 11, there was open season on discussing how Islam contributes to terrorism, whether Islam is a religion of peace or Islam is a religion for terrorism. And I think that there's merit in having those arguments, whatever your opinion is.
Yeah, and by the way, usually claims that it's a religion of violence by people who don't have the slightest idea of what Islam actually is, but by American evangelical preachers who dominated the American scene.
Absolutely, and I think it's a lot clearer. In fact, in Islam, sure, some Muslims commit terrorism, but I think the injunction against harming women and children is pretty clear and uncontroversial. Even if some people might today misinterpret it or interpret it in a different way or say that the conditions are different, so we need to carry it out. But it's very difficult to make an argument for it. It's a lot more complicated when it comes to the Bible and the Talmud, because the Talmud also is more complicated to read, because it's not as if it is out there giving you clear directive like Sharia law, which is saying you do this, you don't do that. It's
it's very, very complicated, by the way. Very few people, except if you spent decades in a yeshiva, really know much about it.
And it's all about, considering the viewpoint and the counter viewpoint, and then coming up with other counter viewpoints, and it's rabbis adding on to this over decades and centuries. So it's, it can get very controversial about what does this actually mean. So there's some pretty shocking verses about even raping children or things like that. But a more nuanced understanding is that, well, no, they're making the argument, and they are making the argument for and argument against. I guess you could maybe make that case, but there is a big spectrum, and I think it's left unsaid that the part of that spectrum that is becoming dominant in Israeli policy over the past few years, but has always been extremely influential, and was arguably very influential in 1948 as well, is the most hardline interpretation, which sees nothing but the idea that there's us, we're a tribe, and everybody who is going to get in our way deserves whatever is coming to them, and this is our land. God gave it to us. And so for me, the really horrific aspect of this is how it contradicts reality. Well, God gave you the land, and now there's children whose families have been living on that land for hundreds of years. Now, any civilized human being thinks, okay, this is property right. Those people own that property. I can't take it from them. But only it takes a special kind of religious fundamentalism to say, nope, that's completely invalid. It doesn't matter if you've owned that land. We can just completely get over that, and we're going to kick you out. And if you fight back, we're going to have to murder you and murder your entire family. And this is very mainstream.
Yeah, well, just to say, the history is complicated. And the complexities are, fascinating, but they don't in any way change my perception of the immediate situation, which is that this is a genocide that needs to stop today. But just to say, the first Zionist of modern Jewish history, Theodor Herzl in Vienna, knew nothing about Judaism. He's basically completely secular. He was not interested in the Holy Land per se. He was interested in a homeland for Jews, because nationalism at the end of the 19th century was the absolute predominant ideology of the world, that you weren't anything if you didn't have a nation. And so Herzl, who knew nothing about Judaism, looked around and he had lots of ideas. Uganda, of course, was one famous place that he looked for. And history took its path, and Britain, definitely one of the most cynical countries in history, promised the land of what is today Israel and Palestine multiple times over to the Arabs, to the French, and to the Jews. So nothing like British perfidy. I think it's unrivaled. Whatever America knows, it learned from Britain, as far as I'm concerned. So in any event, that started, and most of the original Zionists were not religious. In fact, so many were deeply secular socialists, anti-religious. and society became complicated. But for me, my experience with Israel personally, of course, I have family in Israel, and therefore deeper relations. But my personal experience with Israel goes back to 1972, which was my first trip, so 52 years ago. And at the time, Israel was viewed broadly as a secular society. And of course, there was a religious component, but it was definitely a minority, and, even as today, looked down upon by the secularists and so forth. And the ideology of Israel was still pretty much a socialist kind of workers' party, secular ideology. The 6-Day War was of course, one can go back and talk about 1947 and 48, and there's a lot to talk about, but I just want to start with 1967, because the 6-Day War had, practically speaking, the effects that have led us to today in two different ways. When I first arrived in Israel in 1972, just about the first thing that was explained to me was that Israel was going to establish settlements in the Palestinian captured territories. And the phrase that was introduced to me for the first time, I was a high school student, was to make facts on the ground. So this was a completely, in my view at the time, secular view. It had a mix of security. It had a mix of why not? We won this territory. But the idea was we're going to settle these occupied lands. And that was a plan by a famous general at the time, Alon. It was called the Alon Plan. And Alon was not doing it on the grounds of Deuteronomy or the Book of Joshua or anything else. He was doing it on a mix of, I think, for him, overwhelmingly security. Okay, we're going to have security outposts throughout the West Bank, on the Jordan River, et cetera, et cetera. And it became, more generally, an idea, you win, you conquered, so we're going to make settlements. But then what happened, and I watched it, and I didn't understand it very well over time, suddenly there were demonstrations, or you'd see spontaneous dancing in the streets in the late 70s and early 80s of young people with, religious skull caps, kippah in Hebrew, kippot, dancing in this zealous way. And I asked, what is this? And it was a group called Gush Emonim. And this is a new religious movement. Now, what was that? This was the New Settlers movement, and it was led by rabbis, famous rabbis, who started preaching the religious line that this is our responsibility, almost a messianic responsibility, to settle these occupied lands because God gave us these lands. I believe, I'm not the deepest scholar in this, but I believe that there was a shift from the secularism, cynical, and so forth, but from the secularism to this religious movement that came with the settlements in the 1970s and 1980s. And there's some famous rabbis, Rabbi Kook the elder and Rabbi Kook the younger, his son, who promulgated a religious philosophy based on the Bible, that this is our land, God promised it, we're going to take it, and this is the redemption of the Jewish people through this. And of course, these settlements exploded in number to hundreds of thousands, and a lot of it was this religious movement. A lot of it was people who wanted swimming pools and cheap real estate, so it was also totally opportunistic. But a lot of it was the religious movement. My own guess is that this was really something new. And by the way, there were divisions in the Orthodox community because one of the most powerful of the traditional Orthodox communities here in Brooklyn, the Satmar community, is absolutely anti-Zionist, saying, it's idolatry to give so much attention to the land. We need to give attention to our morality, not to the land. And so you can find rabbis standing outside of the UN holding signs that say Zionism is against Judaism. And so there ensued within the religious communities a debate and a division in the 1980s onward. And there is a religious Zionism, which is messianic. It's based on Deuteronomy. It's based on the book of Joshua. It's based on the Talmud. It's based on the things we were talking about. There are other strands of religious Judaism that say exactly the opposite. But what I think happened in Israel is that this religious zealotry gained weight. And, in game theory, as you know well, the weight does not depend strictly on your share of the vote or your share of the population or your share of the seats in the parliament or the Knesset in Israel's case. It depends on whether you determine the governing coalition. And these religious parties that are in this nationalist religious line, and they're represented by this Bezalel Smotrich, for example, who is a leader of the settler movement and is a vulgarian and a genocidal figure as far as I'm concerned, and a senior official in the cabinet, is one of these coalition makers. Netanyahu, who is absolutely one of the darkest and most cynical politicians in modern times, depends on this religious zealot for staying in power. We say in game theory that these small parties have high shapely values. It means that they have a high proportion of determining the coalition in power, even though they're not so dominant in the vote. And Ben Gvir is another one. These are horrible people, in my view. They are murderous zealots. They believe what they say. That's why they're not hiding it. They speak to their followers. They have a huge weight in current Israeli politics because they'll bring down the government. And Netanyahu, who knows what his views are? He'll do anything, and he'll kill women and children in mass numbers to stay in power. This is absolutely clear with Netanyahu. He's a perversion of politics in this way. But I think there was this change that is notable, maybe for Palestinians under the bombs. It's all very theoretical, what I've just said. But I think it's just important to understand how this evolved over time. Yeah, I think the situation in the United States is actually even simpler. And that is the Israeli lobby, by the way, which is this strange amalgamation of rich Jews to an important extent and evangelicals who have their own biblical literalism, looking for the Armageddon, which they think depends on Israel holding these lands. Is simply very powerful in the U.S. and has been powerful for a long time, and has a lot of financial resources. And American democracy is $1, one vote. It's basically a completely corrupt political system based on raising money for expensive campaigns. So the Israeli lobby has long had high influence. From the point of view of most American Jews, I can tell you from my own experience, and I think it's pretty standard, support for Israel was deeply enculturated, for American Jewry, period. And again, it was not seen or foreseen that this was a genocidal impulse, and it was on overwhelmingly secular grounds. So there's very little religious orthodoxy in the Israel lobby at all. You don't even hear about it. My own guess is the following, therefore, it's, again, not an insider's view. First, I don't think most wealthy American political figures or leaders of the Israel lobby, and that's a lot of people on Wall Street, for example, a lot of very big money, I don't think they really understand much at all about this biblical or philosophical or religious nationalist or ideological view. It's more a knee-jerk, support Israel, period. Israel's under threat, support it, period. So I think that there's very little understanding. And again, I'm being a little bit introspective because my own understanding needed a massive scaling up just to understand what was going on and who are these figures, many of whom I had never heard of before, until they became agents of genocide. So this is one part. Second, a politician like Biden, who's nothing but an old school politician, we have no idea what his real state of mind is, capacity to think, or anything else right now, frankly. But his instinct completely is don't show a shade of gap with Israel. Now, by the way, even saying that, it's amazing how even Biden has been out there saying this is terrible what's happening, and have some more bombs, by the way. So I don't think it's cynical, actually, although, of course, in outcome, it's profoundly cynical. It's pathetic is what it is. It's pathetic in that Biden, as a person, clearly sees this is horrendous. It's not a fake. It's not a disguise. But what's pathetic is how weak it is, because the guy, for God's sake, is president of the United States, and he should pick up the phone and say to Netanyahu, you're not getting any more weapons, period. Not with this mass killing. And the United States could shut this down in a day if it chose to. But it doesn't choose to, not because it supports genocide or ethnic cleansing, but because it's so deeply ingrained, don't get ahead of the Israeli lobby bulldozer. It's a bad thing to do. Now, even with all of that, the American Jewish community is, at this point, pretty much in angst and deeply divided. It's in this way a little bit impressive, I would say, although you wouldn't think it's too impressive. But, support for Israel is collapsing among the Jews in America, not just among American society more generally. What's happening is disgraceful, disgusting, illegal, murderous. There's no other word for it, or words for it. And so this is actually permeating a lot of American society. But the political class doesn't live on public opinion. It lives on campaign contributions. And so one big billionaire campaign contributor outweighs a hell of a lot of percentage points of American public opinion till now. I'm not giving up. I'm speaking out because I want the United States to stop arming Israel, period. And not in weeks or months, today, this hour, this moment. And I'm making the point every day because I live in the UN context. We're the last bulwark for a genocide right now. No one else supports this in the whole world. By the way, no one else practically could support it. Some European countries like Germany are afraid to speak out for their own historical and political reasons. But it's only the United States practically that enables this to go on hour by hour. And so I'm trying to make the case in the US, we're completely isolated. It's completely horrible. It is not complicated. It is not complicated. It's not, oh my God, what are we going to do about Hamas and so forth? There are other ways to security than killing tens of thousands of people and starving hundreds of thousands of people. There is such a thing called diplomacy. And this is conveniently or inconveniently or obnoxiously forgotten by the United States because they're not trying diplomacy. But this is the real answer.
No, I agree with you, and I think what you're saying is really very profound. I think for the vast majority of Americans, and I've lived in America, and the idea of Israel is just this romantic thing from Hollywood. I call it Harvey Weinstein Zionism, essentially, where you just get your ideas from all of these amazing Hollywood films, where Israel is the underdog that's out there making the deserts bloom and being fought by all these irrational, crazy people who just hate them for the sake of hating them.
It's a good point, by the way. You know, the bestseller movie was Exodus, not Nakba. So,
Exactly.
You know, if there was Nakba, there would also be understanding of what this is all about.
Yeah.
So you could really have a human solution. But it is a set of images and not a deep understanding, which is a big problem.
And it continues to become more and more separated from the reality on the ground because, as you said, today's Israel is being controlled. I mean, the most important influential ministers are the two you mentioned, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And I think, I mean, you don't have anybody that can be in any way comparable within American politics. It's completely unimaginable for anyone to come up in the U.S. and say, we should do to blacks in the U.S. what? Imagine if just someone said exactly the same thing that Smotrich says. I mean, Ben-Gvir said the need for my family to be able to drive around the streets of the West Bank is more important than anything for the Palestinians. Smotrich said Palestinians have three options: they can leave, they can die, or they can live subjugated to Israelis. I mean, just imagine somebody.
And by the way, he put out a plan. It's not just a slogan.
Yeah.
He actually put out a plan. So you
It's very
have
elaborate.
a major Israeli minister with an elaborate plan of ethnic cleansing or murder or departure. It's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable.
But of
And I
course,
think,
people need to read that. They don't read that. They don't know. Again, even these, the Israel lobby isn't exactly going out of its way to give us a reading list. And so you have to search this stuff out.
yeah, absolutely. And the more time goes on, I think what's happening is just this cognitive dissonance that 6 months of just mass slaughter. I mean, conditioning and propaganda is very difficult to break, but I think a lot of people are beginning to just ask questions now because this doesn't sound like they're just out there to fight terrorism and get the hostages. I mean, there are certainly easier ways. It seems very clear, as many of the hostages' families are saying, it's very clear that the last thing Netanyahu wants at this point is a deal that frees the hostages, because the real goal for him and for his coalition, it's a golden opportunity to use the hostages as an excuse to destroy all of Gaza, to use Hamas's intransigence and Hamas's fanaticism as an excuse to just destroy all Gaza, make it uninhabitable, and get hopefully a couple of million people to leave. That's what Smotrich said.
I think that's right. And if it isn't right, it would take 5 minutes for Netanyahu to make clear that it isn't right. Because all Netanyahu would have to say is, and you may then agree or not agree or whatever, but he would have to say, our enemy is Hamas, but we agree that there will be a Palestinian state, have no doubt about that. Of course, he's never going to say that. This is antithetical. But if he did mean that this is about Hamas, then there's a way to say that and not lose the other 191 UN member states, putting the United States in this limbo position as the 192nd, because there are 193 UN member states in all, and none support Israel to be the greater Israel. which is what Smotrich and Ben-Gvir certainly want, and what certainly what Netanyahu wants as well. So if it were really about security, Israel could say so in a way that is, at least from that point of view, clear. But the fact that Netanyahu, at a minimum, prevaricates about the post-war situation in Gaza really means, of course, that the goal is not defeat Hamas. The goal is greater Israel. And there's not the slightest attempt to dissuade anybody from that supposition, which he could easily do.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to also ask you, you're in touch with RFK Jr., and you're working as an economic advisor, I believe, to his campaign? Or
Well, I'm a friend. We're classmates. I like him, but he does not have an acceptable position on this issue. And I'm not endorsing him under these circumstances, because this is, to my mind, both in and of itself extremely important. And as I've said to him, it's also a test. If you don't recognize this as a genocide, what do you do? And so I'm trying my best to explain my point of view to him. Let me just say, almost all the time. So, and so far, not clearly to any success.
yeah, I think it's massively disappointing, because I mean he was one of the first candidates in a very long time in the U.S. that seems to be offering something different when he talks about foreign policy, when he talks about all kinds of issues. He's even in monetary policy, he's open to Bitcoin and so on. And then
I like Bobby a lot, and we've been friends we were in school together more than 50 years ago, to show my age, but also to just point out we've known each other for a very long time. I like him enormously, but I cannot support a candidate that cannot get this right. I can't.
yeah. And of course, your hero is his uncle, JFK, and you've written a book about his uncle and his quest. And what are your thoughts on the difference between the two of them, and how do you think JFK would have handled this?
Well, I tell Bobby all the time, be like your dad and your uncle, because they were both heroes for me. And I believe, actually, I'm friends with a lot of the Kennedys, and I love the Kennedy family. And I love what President John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy stood for. And Robert Kennedy was my first political love, because John F. Kennedy, I was too young. But Robert Kennedy, I was 13 when he was assassinated, and he was my candidate. And, that stays with you your whole life. So what John F. Kennedy believed in and learned, especially almost the hard way, but learned in his brief presidency, was to negotiate and to try to find peaceful solutions. And he came into the presidency in 1961 saying in his inaugural address, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." He believed in talking. The next 2 years was very complicated and not very successful because the CIA put a plan on his desk to invade Cuba, and Kennedy went along with it to his counter to his instincts, but he did go along with it, and that was the Bay of Pigs, and it was a disaster. And it led Khrushchev to put in nuclear weapons into Cuba afterwards, and that brought us to the brink of nuclear annihilation in October 1962. And Kennedy was surrounded by advisors who said, take them out, military, invade Cuba, which would have likely led to nuclear annihilation. But Kennedy had the instinct, we can find a peaceful way out of this. And in a very complicated maneuver, when there was not a Zoom, not direct communication of global leaders, back channels, teletypes, slow communication, miscommunication, misunderstanding, he worked out a peaceful settlement with Khrushchev. And in the following year, he did what I regard as one of the greatest acts of statesmanship of modern history, why I wrote a book called To Move the World, JFK's Quest for Peace. He negotiated a peace treaty, in essence, with the Soviet Union in the form of the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And what's amazing about it is, and hard for people to understand, negotiating with the Soviet Union in 1963 would be like Biden. I mean, it's possible, but Biden's never going to do it. Would be like Biden standing up and say, I want to make peace with Iran, or I want to make peace with China. Of course, he should do that. And Kennedy had the guts to do it and succeeded and made a great treaty, but it took tremendous guts. And he made a great speech on peace in June 1963 that I absolutely adore. I think it's the greatest speech by a president in modern history, one of the greatest ever. That's what I wrote my book about, this peace campaign. And many people think, and I think it's absolutely plausible, that Kennedy was killed for his peace initiative in the same way that Yitzhak Rabin was killed for calling for peace, in the same way that Martin Luther King was killed for calling for racial justice, in the same way that Robert Kennedy was killed trying to get America out of the Vietnam War. I mean, we have a very dark side, and there's not a small chance that this was a coup in 1963 with the active CIA participation at the least that took Kennedy out. But to come back to your question, these were acts of incredible human insight of John F. Kennedy to save the world and then to move the world towards peace required a great decency and humanity. Decency and humanity can actually get you a long way. The first thing you do is you stop dehumanizing or vilifying the other, and you start understanding that they are human beings. They have a history, they have reasons, and in the case of Palestine, plenty of excellent reasons to want something different from what there is right now. And with some basic humanity, we could sort this out peacefully, not with slaughter or ethnic cleansing or genocide, but peacefully. Of course, we have a president who is, I think, almost surely physically incapable of doing this, but also by dint of his whole political career, intellectually and emotionally incapable of doing this as well. Biden has never been a peacemaker. Biden has always been an agent of the military-industrial complex. He's always been for NATO enlargement. He's always been for dirty tricks. He played a role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in 2014. So I don't think he knows how to do this anyway, which is really terrible at this moment.
And it doesn't look like any of the three main options for the next presidential election is going to be any different. I mean, Trump seems to be similar in the sense of just being full on, give Israel everything they want. If he's critical of Biden, it's that he's not giving them enough. And JFK seems to be the same thing. I mean, it's amazing watching him just turn into evangelical Christian Zionist.
Yeah, the sad part about Bobby is that I think he'd actually win the presidency if he had the right platform, because everyone is so disgusted with Trump and Biden. I think Bobby could actually do it. And so even on purely pragmatic grounds, I wish he would do it. But of course, I want him to do it on deeper grounds, and I want him to do it on Kennedy grounds, which is make peace. It's possible. Don't dehumanize the other side. I keep telling him also, stop inflating Hamas as if it's this unbelievable monster that must be controlled and nothing can happen without addressing that. There are nations, there are other countries, there's diplomacy, there are ways to find peace. And so I'm hoping still somehow that he'll come to that, but it better be quick.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a lost campaign anyway.
And what are your thoughts on what's happening in Ukraine? I know you've been very outspoken about this, and you have very strong opinions about U.S. policy there. What are your thoughts on how that is going and where it is going?
Well, it's basically the same thing. It's a war that absolutely, unequivocally could have been avoided at repeated periods of time, many of which I know well because I was an advisor to Gorbachev and to Yeltsin and to Kuchma, the second president of independent Ukraine. I know this region well. And basically, Ukraine should have done what it said it was going to do when it declared independence, and that's remain neutral. And that's what the people of Ukraine wanted. They know that they're a bridge between Western Europe and Russia. And as a bridge, be neutral on both sides. And they knew that, by the way, by overwhelming majorities. But the U.S. military-industrial complex could not stand that. By the way, if there's one thing that the American deep state hates, it is neutrality. It's not enemies. They love enemies. Enemies get you arms sales. They get you wars. They get you able to practice your military. But they hate neutrals. And the U.S. has a whole history of killing and overthrowing neutral leaders. By the way, it's stunning. And it's the old slogan: if you're not with us, you're against us. And they really believe that, because the statement is almost like a joke, like a caricature, that Darth Vader would say in Star Wars. But no, that's actually the American position. If you're not with us, you're against us. So they hate neutral leaders. And Ukraine the people understood this. They're so much Russian and ethnic culture and shared orthodoxy and faith and many other things. And so they wanted neutrality. They did not want NATO. And yet we had our neocons, Newland, who's about to become my colleague at Columbia. Oh my God.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It'll be Hillary and Victoria. Yes, we said Ukraine has to become part of NATO. And that was a campaign that started in the late 1990s. Biden was absolutely on side on this. Victoria Nuland was first Cheney's advisor, then Bush's ambassador to NATO when they pushed for NATO enlargement, then Hillary's spokesperson, and then the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in 2014, when the U.S. actively participated in the overthrow of a neutral government and installed a government that said, we want NATO. So the war was provoked by NATO enlargement to this crazy degree. And by the way, completely against all the promises that had been made by George Herbert Walker Bush Sr., and James Baker III and others to Gorbachev back in 1990, that NATO wouldn't move 1 inch eastward. Anyway, it kept moving, and then it was supposed to move to Ukraine and even to the country of Georgia on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, which definitely is not a North Atlantic country, if one knows a little bit of geography. But it's this insanity of endless NATO enlargement. Well, suffice it to say, there were numerous exit ramps, and the United States refused all of them. And even after the special military operation started on February 24th, 2022, there was an immediate exit ramp, and that was the direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, calling for Ukrainian neutrality and agreeing on it in talks mediated by Turkey in Ankara. And they were close to an agreement, and the United States said, no, fight on. We don't accept neutrality, fight on. And here we are till today, and Biden absolutely does not talk to Putin. All he does is insult a counterpart who happens also to have 6,000 nuclear warheads. and is beating to a pulp Ukrainians, and Biden's clever ideas to call Putin a crazy SOB. You just cannot make this up. How immature, how puerile, how ineffective, how destructive the U.S. foreign policy is. It's just unbelievable. Any chance for peace they reject because they don't believe in diplomacy.
For me, I think what is the most unconscionable thing about it is when American politicians say, look, we're fighting Putin and it's not even costing us any lives from our military. And it's just, for me, it's so callous and criminal to just, we're burning all these young Ukrainian boys and men, sending them to their graves.
It's not quite Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, but it's in the same ilk. They literally say it's not American lives being lost. Richard Blumenthal, senator of Connecticut, explicitly on this. Greatest bargain that money can buy. Lindsey Graham. I can't even say on public company my true view of him. Mitt Romney. They're all like this. And so it is a kind of vulgarity. Safe, we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. It's incredible to speak with you.
Likewise, we should have finished up how Bitcoin fixes this. 10 years ago, I gave a presentation at Columbia and spoke to Bitcoin. You were a bit skeptical, but a couple of years later, you emailed me saying, okay, there's something there. So I just want to get a quick reaction from you. What are your thoughts on Bitcoin? And let me just tell you why I think it fixes it. If the U.S. government can't print money, 90% of all of these problems are thrown out the door. You just can't hand over tens of billions of dollars to military contractors to keep promoting more and more wars. People are going to have to find a way to talk and reduce those conflicts. It's not going to end conflict, but I think conflict will be a lot less bloody.
Well, let's just say I agree completely that we need to find ways to talk, and we need to discuss Bitcoin because it's been an amazing ride. I'm still, I know it's completely contrary to probably almost every listener, but I'm still worried about completely unmonitored transactions, for good or for bad, because I kind of believe in the rule of law. Admittedly, my belief is predicated on the idea that governments can be made to do the right thing. So I admit our whole conversation proves me wrong on that. And so I don't want to take an overly stark view of this. I'm not by instinct a libertarian because I believe there is such thing as the common good, and I believe I'm basically an Aristotelian in my philosophy. I believe that there can be government for the good, but I know that will run against the grain, and I have to say I didn't give a single shred of evidence in favor of my views over the last hour of discussion. So I don't want to hold them too true and fast. I want to keep them open as provisional. Well, Judge, good to be with you. The whole world, except for the United States and Israel, believes that we need to move now to two states living side by side, Israel and Palestine, with no doubt a wall between them at the start. This is not a happy relationship, but it doesn't have to be a site of bloodshed either. So in 2011, Palestine, which is already recognized as a state by 140 UN member states, though not by the United States, applied for full UN membership as what would be now the 194th UN member state. And when you make that application, it goes to the Security Council after clearing one step with the Secretary General of the UN. Then the Security Council, meeting as an admissions committee, not formally as the Security Council, but it's the same members, decide whether the criteria are met for UN membership. After that, if the answer is decided to be yes, as a yes, then it is forwarded to the UN Security Council for a vote. And if the Security Council approves, then it goes to the UN General Assembly. In 2011, at the technical level, the decision was that Palestine qualifies as a member state. And it would have gone forward but for the United States, which at that point leaned on the Palestinian Authority and said, don't do it right now, it's not convenient, but it'll come very soon. Just accept observer status for the moment. That'll let you in the building, but don't press for full membership. You'll get there very soon. The United States gave assurances that this was just a short adjustment period. That, of course, was 13 years ago. The U.S. And Israel blocked it all that time. When the violence broke out on October 7th with the Hamas attack, and then after that, the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority said we cannot have peace unless we can have our state and our sovereignty for our people. And so they reactivated the application. It wasn't a new application, it was the application that was in suspension because of the United States. When they reactivated, all over the world, government said, of course, this is what is needed. And I had discussions with many senior diplomats, with foreign ministers, with heads of state about this, who believe that, of course, this is the way to end this conflict, that there should be two states, they should live in mutual security, that the United Nations should ensure that they're not at each other's throats when they are both side by side. Incidentally, Palestine would join under the UN Charter as a, quote, peace-loving state. It could not join as a state determined to bring an end to Israel. And the Arab and Islamic countries have made clear now, since the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, so for more than 20 years, that in the event of a two-state settlement, there would be normalization of diplomatic relations across the region with Israel. This would be the core of Israel's security, an end of state of war, an end of funding of military or militia that are in opposition to Israel and so forth. In other words, diplomacy, because a solution would have been reached. So the vote came to the Security Council last week with an overwhelming support, except, as usual, one country stood in the way of the global will. Technically, two. Israel, of course, this government opposes it. It wants ownership over all of the territory, both of Israel and of Palestine. That is the core reason for this conflict. Israel's demands that are, in my view, absolutely incompatible with peace and with justice. But the second obstacle is the United States, which has given essentially a blank check to Israel. And so when the vote came, it was absolutely remarkable. 12 countries out of the 15 voted for. 2 abstained because the UK will never vote against the United States, and Switzerland was the second one, leaned on by the US, and then the US vetoed this measure. Now, this proposition will go to the UN General Assembly, which has the jurisdiction to take up an issue when there is a deadlock in the Security Council. There will be a vote in the UN General Assembly sometime in the coming weeks on Palestine's membership. It will be overwhelming, but it will be advisory. It will show that the will of the world overwhelmingly is for two states living side by side. When the General Assembly takes that action, it will go back to the UN Security Council. Of course, the United States is absolutely preventing a solution right now. That has essentially been true for years and decades, I would say. The U.S. Is not an honest broker. It is a completely dishonest broker in this affair. Israel controls U.S. policy in this regard. The U.S. is completely subservient, despite this not being in America's interest at all. America is diplomatically isolated. It is on the wrong side of history. As we say, it is on the wrong side of justice. It is playing with fire because we are every day in that tinderbox away from a general war in the Middle East. The U.S. is pumping in billions, tens of billions of dollars that we can ill afford, and that is no substitute for peace. And that vote of another 26 billion, depending on which parts you put in for Israel, was just made last Saturday with no strings attached by the U.S. Congress, because basically U.S. policy is run by the Israel lobby in this regard.
Before we get to the Congress, here's Secretary. This will aggravate you, Professor Sachs. Here's Secretary Blinken attempting to answer a very astute question: was the United States isolated at the UN?
On the UN Security Council, the United States was isolated yesterday. Your allies, close allies, France, Japan, and South Korea, both voted for admitting Palestine as a member. The Israelis, including Netanyahu, on the record saying they oppose two-state solution. So what is the path forward, and what message do you give to Palestinians and to moderates in the region if you truly want to isolate extremists?
First, we are committed, the United States is committed to achieving a Palestinian state. We believe that that is vital to having long-term, sustainable, durable peace and security. And of course, it's the only way to fulfill the aspirations, the rightful aspirations of the Palestinian people. But getting to that, achieving that state, has to be done through diplomacy, not through imposition. And the resolution that was voted at the Security Council will have no effect on actually moving things forward.
What is he talking about? The United States is committed to achieving a Palestinian state. This was not done through diplomacy. Does the man know what he's talking about?
Well, to be charitable to him, it's an idiotic statement. To be uncharitable, it is an utterly deceitful statement. I don't know with Blinken which it is. It's sheer, complete foolishness. And it's deadly. It's literally deadly to the Palestinian people. It is extremely dangerous. If he wants to have diplomacy, I can give him some good advice, even friendly advice. I talk to diplomats every day. Apparently, he does not in the same way. I speak to diplomats throughout the Middle East. They are ready for peace. They are ready for Israel's security. What he means is something else, which is that Israel gets a veto on Palestine's right to political self-determination. That there's no principle for that.
Right.
But that's what he's saying. He's saying that Israel gets to veto Palestine's right to self-determination. When that issue came up in the General Assembly several weeks ago in a resolution on Palestine's right to self-determination, the United States was one of 4 countries in the entire world, that's out of 193, to vote against Palestine's right to self-determination. Which were the 4? The 4 were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, which is an island.
Don't we own Micronesia?
Well, Micronesia has a compact with the United States that it must vote alongside the U.S. So it's 110,000 people in the Pacific. And the fourth was a very nice little island named Nauru with 12,000 people. Honestly, the United States is completely isolated. The problem with what Blinken says is that it reflects the astounding arrogance of the United States not to hear anything of the rest of the world and to make these utterances, which are meaningless, self-contradictory, inimical to solutions, and to believe that this is a way that grown-ups would talk. He is our chief diplomat, but he clearly does not understand the first thing about diplomacy in this response. There's every capacity to have a diplomatic solution to this crisis, except if the United States says we take no judgment other than what Israel wants. Because what this government of Israel wants is to deny Palestine anything. And if all we say is diplomacy comes down not to the 8 billion people around the world and the 192 other governments, but only to what one government, Israel, says, that's not diplomacy. That's recklessness.
How dangerous, how reckless, to pick up on your word, was the vote in the House of Representatives to send, again, depending upon the number, 13, 20, or 26 billion dollars to Israel and $61 billion to Ukraine, knowing that the latter doesn't go to Ukraine, the lion's share of it stays here, but it's sort of unleashed a false sense of euphoria amongst President Zelensky and his people. But I'll let you address it. How dangerous was that vote?
Well, what it means is more deaths and more killing and no solutions. For Ukraine, it's a profoundly cynical action to extend Ukraine on the battlefield with thousands and thousands of deaths every month, to extend this past the November election. It's nothing more than that. But it is how our military-industrial state operates. The CIA gave the briefing, and the Congress fell into line, because the CIA, believe me, is more powerful than the White House in this. This is the security state, and it dictates, and we're going to get past November, one way or another. So this was a completely cynical and destructive action, because it was irrational in that there was no coherent discussion of alternatives. Everything that Speaker Johnson had said for months about the need for a plan, the need for a strategy, the need for clear goals, everything was just put aside after he got his CIA briefing, and that was it. So totally irrational, and not even an attempt at how he could switch completely from one day to the next, which is what he did, except that both parties are subservient to the military-industrial complex in this country, not to the American people who are opposed to this, not to the Republican Party, which is overwhelmingly in opposition to this legislation that just passed with substantial Republican support, including support of the Republican Speaker of the House. When it comes to Israel, it is feeding a genocide. The International Court of Justice is likely to rule that Israel is committing genocide in the legal sense of violating the 1948 Genocide Convention. And we are complicit in that, absolutely explicitly. Incidentally, we had Senator Schumer talk about how miserable the Israeli government is. We had several members of Congress say we need to put restrictions on this. There's horrible crimes, war crimes by Israel going on. None of that applied in the end. It's just giving munitions for more slaughter.
Here's the, this will upset you. Here's the scene on the floor of the House of Representatives at the time that the vote was tallied. Take a look at what appears to be in the hands of most of the Republican members of the House as they cheered the announcement of the outcome of the vote.
I missed it, but thank you. Okay. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The chair would remind my colleagues to observe proper decorum. Flag waving on the floor is not appropriate. The House will be in order. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise? I said, no. The gentlewoman from Florida. Okay. The gentlewoman is not recognized. Colleagues, no, I'm going to. The House will be in order.
Like children waving Ukrainian flags on the floor of the House. That was one of the Republicans that voted against it, who admonished everybody else to, quote, put the damn flags away, and then he took the microphone away from her.
Your one's reminded, forgive them, they know not what they do.
Yeah,
What they're doing is sending tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands more young Ukrainians to their death. That's what they're doing, because they are absolutely unaware of any of the real issues in this conflict, unaware of its genesis, unaware of its possible resolution. All they seem to know is war, and they're ignorant. They don't study this. They don't look at alternatives. They don't say one word about diplomacy. They know nothing. They don't understand the consequences. It's regrettable how really sad our government has devolved into almost this ludicrous display of irrationality and immaturity, because that's what this is. This wasn't a considered discussion, a considered deliberation taken after careful reflection of the myriad possibilities, alternative approaches, and likely consequences. This is kind of an ignorant mob waving their flags that has already condemned around 500,000 Ukrainians to their deaths or grave wounds, that has lost a great deal of territory, not because Putin was out to take the territory, but because the United States at every stage refused basic diplomacy over the issue of the U.S. placing its military along the Russian border. That's the issue we've never discussed. That's the issue that the New York Times will not tell its thumb-sucking readers, excuse me, because they can't read that thing as adults, that New York Times. It has no facts. And that's what leads us to this kind of display in Congress. We are in the grips of phoniness and irrationality. We're not considering alternatives. We're not discussing honestly any of the dynamics of these conflicts. We're not discussing where they came from and how they can be ended. It's a game. It's a small insider game. In the end, the Congress buckles in to the campaign contributions of Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics and Boeing and the Israel lobby and all the rest. All these people know is that they got to get out back to their home districts and with the funding for their advertisements so that they can do more damage as re-elected representatives after November. We're in a trap. we're in a trap of utter irrationality. Nothing's explained to the American people. No truth underpins any of these decisions. Nobody wants to debate it. The President of the United States, I'm sure, could not debate this.
No, no, and there was no serious debate on the floor of the House, and
Yes, and excuse me, just to say that the fact that the Speaker of the House could be against it, and then one day flip the position entirely and push it through, just should tell everybody that this is a world of make-believe that happens to leave hundreds of thousands dead as if they don't count, and as if it's not, just as if it's not serious at all.
the same Speaker of the House was against warrantless spying, When the CIA visited him, he changed his mind. The vote in the House of Representatives was 212 in favor, 212 against. The simple amendment to require the intelligence community and the FBI to get a warrant when they want to spy on Americans. He left the Speaker chair to come down to the well of the House and break the tie and vote against that amendment. So whatever the CIA tells the Speaker of the House in secret, boy, I'd like to know what it is, because they get this guy to flip on the most significant issues of our day: the Constitution and human life, war and peace,
without need for any coherent explanation after the fact at all.
Right.
That's the game.
Was a professor, I think you may know her, but was an academic arrested in Israel for something said in a classroom, and then the courts released her the following day. Do I have this correct?
Yes.
Professor Sachs?
I don't know all the details, but there was a professor of Hebrew University arrested for not towing the line on Israel's unacceptable, in my view, positions vis-a-vis Palestine. But what's happening now is we're seeing a general crackdown across universities.
What is happening at Columbia, where you are a tenured member of the faculty?
100 students were arrested for basically quietly protesting on the lawn at the university, and the president of the university called in the police, and 100 students were taken away in zip cuffs, and it's completely broken the community apart. Yale students, several dozen, were arrested in the last 24 hours, from what I understand. The idea that universities should be places of crackdown, and that speech, if you don't like it, that's a kind of harassment that should be shut down. This is what we have come to, because these positions that the U.S. government is taking, or that Israel is taking, are not defensible, by the way, in normal debate and discourse. So opposition to them is met increasingly violently by the arrest of our own students. It's shocking to see, except that this is what has become the American political scene.
This happened the day after the president of Columbia University appeared before a House committee known for berating university presidents and threatening that the millions of dollars that the federal government gives for legitimate academic research would be restricted if the federal government's view, if the Biden administration's view, although in this case the interrogators were Republicans, they're hardly in the Biden administration.
Let's just say in Washington's view, because it's the Congress and the White House.
Correct. If in Washington's view, the speech was contrary to what Washington wanted to hear, haven't they remembered that they took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, which includes the First Amendment? And the last time you and I read it, it said, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech.
No, they don't recall that. They don't believe it. They are utterly irresponsible and opportunistic. The decision to arrest the students was taken not the day after, it was taken the same day as the president's testimony that evening. It was taken without consultation with the students, without an attempt at a face-to-face discussion. It was not taken in response to violence. It was the New York Police Department coming onto the campus and arresting students that were sitting on the lawn or in tents. Whatever the law, and I think it violated the law, I can tell you it broke the community in two, because universities have an ethos. The ethos is that they are a community. They're a place where you study, where you debate, you can argue, but it's a place of thinking, and thinking can be tough. It can be very hard debate.
But
You
these
can
people
you can
wanna
hear
take
things.
these
You can
people-
hear things you don't want to hear.
Right.
That's part of life.
These
The
people
students
want to
need to
take a
face that too.
category of speech and say it is unprotected. The government can go after you for that category of speech. They can call it hate speech, dangerous speech, whatever they want to call it. That's why all speech is protected, particularly in an environment dedicated to the dissemination of unpopular ideas.
But the kind of speech that the most famous attack was on the chant or the saying or the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, the river is the Jordan River, the sea is the Mediterranean, and it is a chant for Palestinian rights. It could be a claim for one state. It could be many things, but what it surely is political speech.
Absolutely.
And that's extremely important. In fact, the irony of this is, of course, the extremist Israeli leaders use exactly the same phrase. They also talk about from the river to the sea, there will be greater Israel. So there's a symmetry. On one side, it should be all Palestinian. On the other side, it should be all Israel. I happen to disagree with both sides, but I don't think that it's right to arrest people for saying this from either side. That's the idea of political debate. It's also not right to be bombing people because you're trying to create a greater Israel. So there are limits. The limits are the bombs, the mass killings, the 35,000 people dead at Israel's hand by the current count, but it's expected that the actual count is multiples of that, because there are people under the rubble. There are people who are starving to death. There are people who are dying of disease. There are people who are dying of lack of medical care because the hospitals have been bombed out. That's what should be prohibited. This war, not speech, not even heated speech. Heated speech is not calling to attack a student or not. That kind of assault is not permitted. But the charge that the congressional members made was directly, explicitly about political speech in a context where we need political debate. We need more political debate, not less of it.
Here's a congressman from New York. I couldn't believe I was seeing this. The last clip we'll play for you, because I know this will get under your skin also. Offering a resolution condemning the phrase. I never heard of this fellow, Congressman Anthony Desposito, but watch this.
My resolution condemns the slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, because it is blatantly anti-Semitic. Madam Speaker, I remind my colleagues that this slogan was used by Iranian leaders responsible for the recent attacks on Israel. This slogan communicates one thing and one thing only. It is not human rights. It is certainly not peace. It is the violent destruction of the state of Israel and the Jewish people that live within it. To employ this slogan is to perpetuate the cause of hate and regional instability. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea sits Israel, a free, diverse nation, a safe haven for Jewish people, formed in the wake of the mass murder of European Jews. When the world witnessed the tragedies of the Holocaust, we said never again. Now is our chance to mean it and to reject anti-Semitic hate in all of its forms, whenever and wherever it rears its ugly head.
I don't know if they actually voted on this resolution. It's reprehensible that Congress should think it even can be in the business of condemning speech, no matter what the speech says. Hate speech.
But by the way, it's so interesting, so sad, so primitive. Here's a representative. He says, in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean lies Israel. If he had said, in between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean lies Israel and Palestine, well, then we would have the start of the discussion that the whole rest of the world is having.
Right.
Between the river and the sea, there are two peoples and two nations. And the Palestinian nation, Palestinian state, already recognized by 140 UN member states. But he doesn't say that. And it's meaningful that he doesn't say that. He's ignorant, I'm sure, but completely insensitive to the realities. Now, while one side is chanting about from the river to the sea, maybe wanting one state, which many people, by the way, Jews and Palestinians believe, although most do not, most want two. But just as people are chanting that, on the other side are Israeli leaders who use the same expression, from the river to the sea, for greater Israel. And they're not just chanting it, they are killing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians right now before our eyes to achieve their aim. That's a difference. And this congressman just voted more money for that, for the killing. So he doesn't see the irony that a slogan used by both sides to mean the opposite in each direction, he's condemning one side, not the other, while the other side is slaughtering the counterpart. Slaughtering. And not just slaughtering the counterpart, killing one child every 10 minutes in Gaza at the latest count, every 10 minutes, but with this congressman's vote, his approval, his vote for the munitions to do that slaughter. So he's complaining about speech, but he's complicit in mass murder. Good for him. How intelligent. This is our Congress.
Right.
It's astounding.
Kemana lah HP Mima itu hilang, ha? Hah? Gak tahu. Carilah HP-nya. Hilang-hilang terus loh. Tiranto hilang, ini hilang. Gimana Mima terakhir pakai HP-nya? Hah?
Enggak tahu. Lupa.
Mak, nggak dapet loh HP-nya ini loh, Mak. HP Bima itu nggak nampak tadi mana taruhnya.